I declare NDP 10 defeated. All right, now, shall Clause 10 carry with no amendments? All in favor of Clause 10? All in favor? All opposed? Clause 10 is carried. All right, now we go to Clause 11, and we have PV 9, again, a move by Ms. May, proposed by Ms. May. Any discussion on PV 9? This is Clause 11. Mr. Davies.
Yeah, I don't know if it speaks exactly to the amendment, but on Clause 11, we didn't hear a lot of evidence about this, but this is a section that says, unless authorized under this Act, the importation or exportation of cannabis is prohibited. And, you know, I think it's, from the New Democrats' point of view, and I think the Conservatives as well, the fact that the Liberals limited evidence on this groundbreaking, centuries-old, changing legislation to 5 days of hearing, and to those who may be listening, saying that there's 90 witnesses sounds like a lot of witnesses, but when you got 35 million Canadians and many groups and stakeholders that were shut out of testifying for this committee, including ordinary Canadians and young Canadians and licensed producers and edibles manufacturers, of whom we heard from none. It leaves gaping holes in this legislation and sections of this act that were left without any testimony at all. And I've been wondering since those days of hearing about what the rationale behind prohibiting exportation of cannabis and cannabis products would be. In my research for this, I have talked to licensed producers who have licenses from the federal government, distributors who distribute in British Columbia, licensed dispensaries. I've talked to manufacturers. We had a number of excellent witnesses testify before this committee who have decades of experience in cannabis products and also in the medicinal use of it, and also in the different products that go along with it, the creams, the tinctures, the sublingual tablets, the nasal sprays, the vaporizer pens for those that don't want to smoke. And they tell me that there's billions and billions of dollars at stake for Canada to become a world leader in responsible cannabis products. And they tell me that Canada right now, if we do get our legislation right, should be able to export our responsible and research-based products, certainly to countries or jurisdictions that have legalized. We know that as Uruguay has. We know Portugal has decriminalized all drugs, although I'm not sure that I understand exactly what they've done. Once California legalizes, cannabis will be legal from the Mexican border to the Arctic Circle, really everywhere but the border between BC and Washington. And yet, we are hamstringing what could be a sustainable, science-based, very lucrative, innovative, technologically driven industry, and we're saying Canada can't export any of that to the world. Now, again, I wish we would have heard a single witness who could have testified what the rationale of this prohibition is and you know, why it's considered a wise course of action. I didn't hear any, so I'm left only with my own experience talking to people who tell me that we're actually risking Canadian entrepreneurs and Canadian industrial technology's current advantage in the world. Surely other jurisdictions in the world are not far behind Canada and will be starting to develop cannabis products that are safe, that are properly dosed, that are legal either for medicinal use or otherwise. And so, you know, to me, I don't know if anybody from the department can maybe speak to why we are in this bill banning the exportation of cannabis. I'd like to know if there's any thoughts on that. At least to willing jurisdictions, other jurisdictions that would legalize it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And what I'll point out is that the part one of the bill kind of sets out these prohibitions, and as you noted, the beginning of the clause begins with unless authorized under the Act. So it's part 3 of the Act, which would actually provide the minister with the authority to authorize both the export and import of cannabis. And it's actually set out in clause 62 sub 2, where the minister's discretion or the minister's authority to issue those license or permits is limited to cannabis in respect of medical or scientific purposes or in respect of industrial hemp. And so that would maintain the status quo as it exists today under the CDSA, where licensed producers or Canadian industrial hemp producers can be authorized to export their product to other countries.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Thank you for that. So you said it maintains the status quo, so I take it that the legislation still would prohibit the export of any kind of recreational cannabis that's contemplated by this bill?
That's correct. The minister's authority is limited by that clause I just mentioned,
Right.
To only medical, scientific, or industrial hemp purposes.
Right, I guess so my question, though, is why is that the case? Because I know this legislation only deals with recreational cannabis. So why would we not be able to export recreational cannabis or cannabis products to other jurisdictions that have also legalized it?
So I understand the question, Mr. Chair, but as an official, I can't really explain the government's reasoning in making that decision, only to point out that that's the way the legislation is currently drafted.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, Ms. Gladue.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with my NDP colleague that I was very concerned we didn't hear testimony, especially from places like Uruguay, which was the only other country to have legalized. And understanding, what they did in this area might indeed be very helpful. But I know with 272 days left to go, the Liberals are in quite a hurry to get through this. My question has to do with the medical marijuana export. I happen to have a company that does export to, I believe, 9 countries. But as I understand it, under the current treaties that we've signed with the UN, there's a limit to the amount that Canada as a nation is allowed to export. And so will they bump up against that in terms of this legislation?
So thank you again for the question, Mr. Chair. I can't speak specifically to what you're saying under the access to cannabis for medical purposes regulations. If what you're saying is in fact accurate, and we can endeavor to provide an answer. What I can say is that under the Cannabis Act, if it's enacted by Parliament, a new framework would be established in regulations that would deal with the import and export process, and so that's to be decided by government, I would say.
Okay. Who is Mr. Oh, Ms. LaBelle, yes.
To add to that response, under the drug conventions, Canada is required to report the amounts of cannabis that are used and sold for medical purposes. And that is an aspect we don't expect to change. Whether it actually creates a ceiling as to how much can be exported is up for question.
Okay. Mr. Van Kesteren.
Chair. I just want to say in the outset that, Mr. Davies, I commend you for your advocacy of attacking the premise that if this is a legitimate drug, if this is legislation that is purposeful, if this is legislation that is good for society, and you firmly believe that, and I respect that, then the heavy-handedness that we're seeing from the government is really hard to understand. We've had some discussion with some of the officials about how we deal with other countries, and in my motion, I would argue that the most important part of that motion is this is big. This is going to change us fundamentally as a society. And there are groups out there. I'm talking about moms and dads with kids in school. I'm talking about surgeons and physicians that have some serious concerns. But there also are groups outside of our jurisdiction. And I'm curious if the officials, we mentioned Paraguay, as a nation, and it's often held as an example of a jurisdiction that has adopted these. And from the research that I've done, there's very it's very slim at best to suggest that this is at all like what we're proposing in this country. The Netherlands, where my parents come from, that had a very relaxed set of laws are reverting. They're going back to another position. So I want to ask the officials, do you feel that we've done enough? And again, in light of the fact that this legislation will be passed and will be enacted in July of 2018, have we done enough? Have we searched and have we communicated to other jurisdictions? Have we looked at other jurisdictions? I would suspect that they're really this is cutting edge, but have we? In light of the importance of this legislation, have we really done enough to make an educated decision on this legislation? I invite anybody to respond. Mr. Costa.
So thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to do my best to answer the member's question. We've, as officials, have benefited greatly from conversations with our counterparts in jurisdictions, not only in the U.S. states, but in the Uruguayan government. Having been in the role that I'm in for a number of years now, I can say that we've, I think, developed what would be fairly described as some fairly strong relationships into all of those jurisdictions, so that we can understand the issues that they're working through and benefit as much as possible from the lessons that they're willing to share with us. It may be of interest to the member. I just recently returned from Portland, Oregon last week, where there was a meeting of all of the heads of the regulatory programs in the U.S. states for the very purpose that you were describing, where we can discuss the issues, share lessons learned, and so I believe that Canada is listening very closely.
Just a quick follow-up. Have you done, Mr. Costin? Have you had discussion with, for instance, with physicians? Have you in those jurisdictions? Have you had discussions with soccer moms? Have you had discussions with the police?
So we've had discussions primarily with government representatives, but that would also include law enforcement.
Have you had discussions with physicians?
Also members from the healthcare community in those jurisdictions as well, yes.
And you've reported on that as well, too?
Pardon me?
You've reported on that as well, too?
I've reported?
Do we have the information that we can glean from their testimony and their responses?
I can really only speak to what the meetings that I've been at and the presentations that I've heard and the discussions that I've been part of, and perhaps also that the task force in their report also reflected on. I understand they also visited those jurisdictions and had conversations with a wide range of individuals. So.
I think we have Mr. Davies next, and if we could confine it to the amendment, we're kind of getting off base here. I want to point out to Uruguay, the fact that we didn't have anybody from Uruguay has come up a couple of times here, and we had over 100 witnesses, and all of the names were submitted by all of the parties, and nobody submitted a name from Uruguay. No party did, so I just want to make that clear. Mr. Davies.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I'm just going to continue speaking about the importing exporting, because that's section 11 here, and we're talking about the punishments for violating that. Just a few things I think are important to put before colleagues here at this table here. And one of them is that I talked to a licensed producer, a very large licensed producer who's producing for the medicinal market now, who told me that their company is contacted every week by a foreign business or foreign jurisdiction that wants to learn from them or go into business with them or partner with them. And I'm reminded of Kirk Tusaw's testimony where he looked pointedly at the committee and he said, you know, you politicians are talking like you're creating a market. You're not creating a market. He said, the market exists. There's a $7 to $10 billion market in Canada right now, regardless of what we do. And so what we're really doing by this legislation is we're trying to in my view, we're trying to modernize the regulatory frame, and I congratulate the government on taking steps towards this, because we're trying to take that illicit market into the light And we're trying to recognize that not only can we shed the harms of criminalization, but we actually can regulate it properly and make this a legitimate business. You know, we export spirits and wines in this country. We're all proud of Canadian wines that have a global reputation as we're sending that around the world. In fact, I think the Conservatives have taken the lead on showing the problems we have with overly restrictive transportation of beer across borders. We can't even buy beer in one province and take it across. So in my view, and maybe the Conservatives don't necessarily share this perspective, to me the trend on cannabis is we're moving towards ever more legalization. And Canada being a leader in that regard, getting ahead of the curve, I think would position us well. We have to remember that in Washington, in Oregon, in Colorado, that they legalized cannabis by citizens' initiative. This is what the people wanted. And I think actually in many cases the populations are ahead of the politicians on this. And I think the world is moving in this direction. So, you know, that's why I think that what I'm hearing from the market and the business people who are involved in this is that if we regulate this properly and move forward, Canada can actually not only legalize and legitimize the illegal market here in Canada and create tax revenues and get healthier and save our justice system a lot of grief, but actually we can position Canada to actually be a leader in a very lucrative and growing product on the world stage. And I just want to conclude by saying, Mr. Van Kesteren, I don't say that it's good necessarily. I say cannabis is what cannabis is. It is an adult use substance that alters consciousness. It also has significant medicinal advantages that are beyond doubt. I just think that it's a product that adults use, whether we want them to or not, and the criminalized approach is simply not an appropriate way to regulate that substance any longer. So that's why I'd like to see this legislation changed, and I'm going to move that section 11(1) be amended to allow the minister to make regulations that would permit the exportation of cannabis covered by this act. I don't know if I can. If you want language on that right now, or if the concept is good enough. Perhaps I'll draft it for tomorrow morning.
That would be really good,
Okay.
because we've got, let's finish up with PV9. I was just
Okay.
thinking Elizabeth May would be proud of us, because we spent a lot of time on her two-line amendment.
Well, actually, I'm talking about 11(1), Mr. Chair. It's not her amendment.
But we're on PV9 at
Yes.
the moment, so that's what this debate is about. So I want to bring Mr. Oliver. I want to bring PV9 to a vote. We're at 5:30 now, so if we can get a decision on PV9, all in favor of amendment PV9? All in favor? All opposed? All right, PV9